Since today is our last group discussion as we get ready for paper 3 and really close out talking about the connections between the different articles and then the documentary that you guys read for homework as we get into the paper 3 prompt. Because of course, as I mentioned really briefly on Monday, our class next Monday is going to be going over drafting. So how to organize and respond to the prompt effectively. And then of course the rough draft is due next Wednesday since essentially our week is a little different because of Veterans Day, the next week after. So today we're just going to talk about that connection between the 3 stories and then go over the prompt and the different moral questions that we are going to be considering as we prepare for the 3rd paper. So moving forward with that, for homework, you guys were watching CBSN Speaking Frankly on cancel culture and writing a discussion post. So I wanted to start today with what your thoughts were. So what stood out to you guys about how that documentary was organized, the stance that the documentary took? Was that stance clear? Any observations, thoughts, criticisms, especially as we build towards our discussion of how the 3 articles work together? Well, the 3 sources. Like, what stood out to you guys about that documentary? What do you guys think?
Okay. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, what stood out to me was actually, I guess, because I believe it was last week's class, I compared, cancel culture to basically a tantrum, and that's what basically they started off the video. So I was already engaging in the video, so it stood out to me, like setting what they're going to be formatting it. And well, overall, I actually liked it because I agree to most things that they were saying in the video. How I honestly think, in a personal take, cancel culture does take it too far. But I was really agreeing to, I believe she was like a professor in social media. I don't know her name. I forgot her name. She was a bald-headed lady. I was agreeing a lot more with her perspective, how she was saying, and then how they were just saying in general how it is about power, you can say. Yeah. But yeah, overall, I actually like the video of everything they were saying.
Because that is, like, I think the biggest thing that this video adds to the conversation that Bromwich and Beauchamp present. It's really focusing on that power structure. And of course, I'm glad you enjoyed it. And of course, it was really interesting looking at that tantrum as the beginning part. I see Artie brought up the very sad example of the guy who made the video about Chick-fil-A, and Raymond saying, like, that was messed up. Like, if we think about this, just like what they present versus our previous sources, if we think about the documentary, it's really presenting like normal people being canceled over celebrities. So there is that difference. Especially if we think about like the consequences. And of course, if we think about like the example for the Chick-fil-A guy, like what was the most notable thing about his example, separate from how messed up it was, if anything? Like what really stood out about his?
Well, I can say, because I've seen his video before on YouTube. So I've seen him, and when I saw it towards the end of the video, I was like really shocked. I was like, oh, okay, it's understandable. But what stood out to me is how, even after everything happened, how cancel culture really affected his life. You can say for years, because as he was explaining, he was trying to get, job after job, and it was just basically like, it was hopeless for him, you can say, and how cancel culture really took over his life, even after the aftermath, you can say. It was like actually realizing the aftermath for him, how bad it was for the decision that he took.
Yeah. So in terms of, it's not a little thing. And of course, if you think about that video, right, it was very, very extreme. as you guys have mentioned, like in that chat as well, especially because like if we're thinking about cancel culture being focused on like activism and focused on like telling people that they did something wrong they should change, that as an example is really showing like it affected him for years and there was no opportunity for him to change. Like the jobs that he was applying for never gave him a chance to show that he had changed or that he was sorry. It just was lingering in terms of that public outrage in a moment in his life. And of course, if we think about what you guys have emphasized with the death threats, wanting to commit suicide, like really emphasizing how this can be really like bad for mental health. And it's going too far in terms of like, if we think about death threats, it's getting kind of violent. So it's like, even if his actions were wrong, like why would people think that his actions weren't death threats? Like if we're thinking of like a moral situation and you're calling him out for being morally wrong, like what is the point of, like, aren't you morally wrong essentially for threatening somebody's life? So it's kind of like it goes against like the very purpose of like advocacy, if we think about it, that was mentioned in the video we watched last week. So James brings up an interesting point. So thinking that he was irresponsible. So what if we think about another part of this example that really stands out, stood out for me, especially if we think about him coming across as irresponsible. Like one thing that he really notes is this was like a video that he made for like his friends, his followers. He did not intend for it to go viral, but he made the choice to put that video out there. So that really complicates it. So we can see like James sees it as irresponsible. Like, what are your thoughts about that video? Like, what if we think about like, if we're thinking about punishing people for choices, right? Like, so where do we draw that line in terms of the choices? Like, is he like can be found guilty because he chose to post it and put it out there? Or is it something that it's bringing in that issue of privacy? Yeah, so Artie brings up the point. So he shouldn't have taken it out at the worker, right? Which is definitely a big thing in terms of cancel culture, especially if we think about corporations, right? And we talked about Chick-fil-A. If we are canceling Chick-fil-A because of the owners or what that corporation believes in or supports, right? It's not fair or morally right to take it out on the worker. So he was in the wrong. And then James brings up the really good point, like as an activist, you should be prepared for judgment. So, thoughts on that? Especially if we think about him as an example. So because he was taking a stand and making that stand public, he should be preparing himself for judgment from other people. Trying to think in terms of Dan, your comment, so you agree they think because they're an activist they can't be wrong or they can't be canceled themselves. So that's like a really interesting point if you think about cancel culture, especially if we think about the consideration of like the dilemma of like who, if cancel culture is activism, right? Why, like how does that complicate cancel culture itself, especially if it turns on the person who's canceling others.
I think it kind of goes back to that whole like tantrum thing. You know what I mean? Because when a toddler's throwing a tantrum, are they listening? No, it's just what they want in that moment. And I think that's why they kind of tied in with this whole like activism / cancel culture. You know, for example, that teacher, you know, he was trying to explain his thought process. He was trying to let them know, you know, what his words actually meant. But, you know, they're just screaming at him, no, 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 you should be fired. Like, you're wrong. You're racist. You know, and that's, you know, they basically had a tantrum until they got what they wanted.
So if you're going to pass judgment, right, you still need to listen, especially if we think of like, we want people to change. Well, if you're not listening for the change, like, is that really what you're looking for then? So that is really important, right? Any other thoughts?
Since we're bringing up that last video, I think this brings into the organization. I think there is a reason they ended with that video, proving a point on cancel culture is basically in a way a tantrum. So I believe they strategically placed it at the end of the video.
Yeah, so to really emphasize like the issue of it being about not listening, so not like having a conversation about this and creating real change, which is the biggest thing if we think about like the examples of cancel culture being a good thing. If we think about the example of like Bill Cosby, if we think about Harvey Weinstein, right, those that people were able to speak out, and then that did lead to investigations and then of course charges. But of course with these like real life people, right, not having those conversations. And then Artie brings up, so there's also the perspective that someone mentioned in the video where cancel culture gives regular everyday people voices and power that they otherwise don't have. That is a really good point here, especially if we're getting into how cancel culture is about power. So if we think about like examples, right, if we think about power within our society and the most commonly thought about examples of people being canceled, most of them are people in power. So celebrities, politicians, people that have a lot of money if they are basically in like production for film or whatever, higher up in corporations. So if you think about cancel culture, right, there is this power dynamic that is really interesting, especially if we think of the power like between basically society and those, well, actually individuals, not necessarily society. And breaking down, right? Canceling someone and being vocal about disapproval is like one of the only ways that we can stand up against people who have more power within society because they have a bigger platform or a bigger voice, or they have more access to different resources. But if we think about that issue of power, it gets more complicated when it comes to like the everyday people, like the teacher, that guy who posted that video about Chick-fil-A, who aren't in the same positions of power as celebrities, politicians, or people who are up the corporate ladder. So if we think about it, like if it's about power, like when cancel culture works effectively, it's when like people with less power go after those who have more power. But if they're on the same, right, there's no way for a normal person to get a word in because they don't have the same platform that a celebrity does in terms of posting something and getting heard or being able to speak out, if we think about the teacher example. So that is really important for this conversation. Any other thoughts about that or comments?
I think like with most groups, cancel culture started out as a good thing, but
Mhm.
there's always the people that take it to the extreme. Like we said, like, bringing down people in power. That CFO that posted the Chick-fil-A video, I think because, he was a CFO, and he was so high in the company, the company had to take,
Mhm.
such a drastic action. I think if it was just like a nobody, low level, then okay. But, being at that level, you almost have a voice for the company,
Mhm.
and I think that's why they had to take that action, to show, hey, like, because that could potentially hurt the business.
Because anyone high up in a company, which is Dan's really good point, they represent that company no matter what situation they're in, even in their private lives. Um, so it's like it's only becomes if we think of that example when it got messed up, it only became problematic when it was all of his future job opportunities, right? Because of course he had no power in that dynamic.
Yeah.
And this really kind of brings up that quote. I don't remember who says it or if it's just one of those sayings. I'd have to kind of look it up. But this idea that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Have you guys heard that before? So if you think about like that could be a change within cancel culture, like people got too much power being able to cancel somebody and then that corrupting the purpose of cancel culture when it basically goes too far. I'm not sure. I probably do a quick Google, but I know that is a pretty common saying. Um, Basically, because of course, the idea that with the more power you have, the more, if you think about it, access you have to opportunities or money, disposable income you have to use to whatever kind of purpose you want. Lord Acton, that's so crazy. I've never heard that name before, but we know that. I know that quote. So that's also in terms of, yeah, that's a pretty common quote that kind of is used in a lot of situations like this. Um, any other thoughts, observations about the documentary?
I'm glad that teacher at the end got a settlement, though.
I mean,
I feel like in that case, like the school board kind of, looked at it and thought, okay, like, he's not completely wrong, but they had to save face because now, that could, damage their reputation and their enrollment and all that.
so it's
And,
like,
their job is to protect the community school versus, one teacher.
so it's like he was thrown under the bus, but like at least he wasn't just completely left out to dry, essentially.
Yeah. They actually sat down and obviously looked into it, and, someone determined, okay, like obviously he didn't mean this, in a racist way. So,
Yeah. It also kind of brings up like that importance in terms of what we brought up, I think, last week, in terms of doing the research yourselves and taking action based on it. So they can definitely see with that real example, they did that, but still had to make that choice, but at least like they did, and they did it responsibly. Any other thoughts? Or perspectives? Okay. So moving forward, as we start to make connections between all of the different sources as we build towards our third paper, it's really important to consider, right, how these sources are working together to add to this conversation surrounding cancel culture. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a few minutes for you guys to get into small groups so that you guys can choose. So if you don't have the articles handy, I do recommend taking a moment and opening them up on your computer. So what you guys are going to be doing in your groups is you're going to choose two of the sources. So you can either choose like Bromwich, Beauchamp, and or the documentary So you don't have to focus on all three if you don't want to. And then you want to identify a quote or example or a point that the two sources make. So if we think about the documentary, it's a little harder to use a quote, so you can just kind of paraphrase an example that stood out to you, or a point that the documentary made that stood out to you. And then you're going to discuss like how they work together to add to this conversation surrounding cancel culture. Because if we think about the three sources, while they have some similarities, they do bring up different examples or different perspectives about them. Especially if we think about the documentary, which if we think of that biggest difference between the documentary and the two other sources is the documentary definitely emphasizes and focuses on examples of just normal people within our society instead of celebrities, which tends to be the most common example cited within Bromwich's and Beauchamp's articles specifically. So talk about that, like, do they extend, complicate, illustrate, or challenge each other's points? So really focusing on like, where can we draw them together, right? In terms of making comparisons even. So any questions about what we're gonna be doing in our group work before I put you into those groups? So we're gonna take about 20 minutes in these groups. So we'll reconvene at 11 a.m. And then we're gonna talk about your observations and what points you compared and how they work together as a class. So I'm gonna put you in the groups now. So let me stop the screen share.
And it's Beauchamp's. It's the end of page like 5 going into 6. It's that last sentence. And the rise of social media has given individual citizens powerful new tools for challenging elite opinion and holding them accountable. So we looked at it as not so much as like, you know, that was kind of the beginning, was they weren't looking to cancel these people, you know, tear them down, destroy them, you know, but holding them accountable, you know, making them, you know, either change the way they do things or say, hey, you know, you're not the right person for this. You know, you need to be looked into, viewed at, whatever the case may be. You know, it wasn't necessarily death threats like, oh, we're going to murder you and your family, like you're racist. You know, it's just like you have to say for yourself, you know, like we have some questions we want to know.
Yeah, explain like what you were thinking, why you did this. So really emphasizing, if we think of like the purpose of cancel culture and like maybe cancel culture is not the problem, it's how people have changed it or corrupted it. Kind of brings us back to that Lord Acton quote in terms of they got the power, so then people took advantage of it. So definitely. So if we think of like, what did you connect that to? If we think about the other sources, do the other sources kind of illustrate that or kind of identify or present like a connection to that in any way?
So kind of coming back to that whole absolute power, same thing with that teacher, you know, they went to that extreme where, you know, they didn't want to hear him out, you know, it wasn't to hold him accountable, you know, they came for his head.
Yeah.
You know, they went to the extreme, you know, it wasn't, oh, well, why did you say it? It was just, you know, we're canceling you because we're right kind of a thing.
Yeah. And definitely like ignoring that he was trying to be like, take responsibility and explain himself, or at least understand. So it's kind of, he wasn't able to. Awesome. Anything else that your group kind of identified or were talking about?
Rochelle had some good stuff. If she wants to share, it's up to her.
Oh, sorry. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah, you're good.
got it. Okay, let me. Oh my gosh, I was gonna say. Okay, I was going to bring up this quote from Deflating the Cancel Culture Debate on page 7, paragraph 5. And it is, so it is not just that these people have to raise their voices in order to be audible. It's also that when their tone becomes the issue, their speech is essentially being heard as mere noise, disruption, and commotion. Their freedom of speech is radically undercut by what is aptly known as tone policing. which is just like it goes back to what Daniel was talking about. So when there was this professor, and then he had views that many of the students didn't necessarily agree with, and obviously these students have a right to speak their mind and able to express their views, but then in the way that they kind of came about it, and like not even just that alone, if we're talking about different issues in which people like kind of raise up and talked, it's like, yes, there were times where like they were able to talk, and then they were able to understand each other, and it wasn't necessarily through like death threats and not necessarily through active acts of violence. But then it's like, when like, I thought this quote was definitely really interesting, because then if there are groups of people, or there's individuals that are speaking up and trying to hold certain people, commodities, companies, influencers accountable, then it's like, because of how cancel culture has escalated, and like obviously the term cancel culture now is to an extreme. It goes back to like tone policing, or it's just, oh, you're just saying that, like, oh, it's just mere noise, disruption, commotion, or whatever. Hopefully I'm explaining it right. I don't know if I am, but yeah, that was my thoughts on it.
I think you did a really great job. I think that's a really important point to kind of call attention to, especially after discussion last class in terms of the tiers and of course like the different ways we can address these different actions. So tone is really important with that, because of course that can really change that whether or not you can even have a conversation. So if your tone is very like accusatory or angry, right, it's going to be a lot harder to get that person to listen to you. And then their tone, their response may come across as too defensive. So then you're not even going to kind of listen to how they're responding. So if we think about like a proper tone, right, because tone of voice can really change like how much somebody's willing to open up, right? What tone would be effective when you're calling attention to actions that other people have done that you find to have been offensive or have gone too far? Like, what tone should be used? Especially if you think of like creating and beginning that conversation.
Well, we were talking about the whole like Chick-fil-A example. The fact that he went in there like basically on the offensive and just attacked her, like, how can you live with yourself? Like, how do you bring these values? We brought up the point, like, she's probably just trying to make ends meet, like get something to eat after work, do schoolwork, whatever the case may be, and we said, like, if he went in trying to have a conversation, like, hey, do you know what your CEO said? Do you agree with these values? If not, maybe consider working somewhere else. Like we said, like, I brought up last class, like, bring them into the conversation versus attacking them. Because as soon as you attack them, you're going to be like, well, screw you, pal. Like,
yeah. Or even like, so being open to their perspective, or even be empathetic for that situation. Because of course, you don't know that worker's situation. Maybe this is the only job she could get, and she needs like that money. So definitely starting that can be really important, because of course if you're on the offense, then somebody else is going to be on the defense, and then you're not going to get through and have a conversation at all. Definitely. So empathy, openness.
yeah, because he said her from the get-go, he's like, why I got a free water? And then she's like, no, why? Like, curious. And then like he just laid into her, and she's just like, oh, that's not like, I was just trying to give this man his water. Now I'm being attacked. That's.
Yeah. And of course, like, what if somebody in the future asks for free water? Like, is it going to lead to that snowball in terms of, well, we're not going to offer free waters if you're not buying anything ever? And that some person who really needed that water is no longer going to get that free water. Interesting. Awesome. So those are really good points, really good observations in terms of that connection. And then what about group 2? So you had Bridget, James, and Kenya. What did you guys find? Oh, sorry. I did not see that people were adding to the chat. James was already prepared. So focused on why there is a movement, the public need for accountability, and the view of social justice advocates. The influence of Twitter is helping liberate them by bringing the perspective of marginalized groups into the public sphere, forcing the white, straight, cisgender male establishment to take views seriously that they had otherwise ignored, from Beauchamp. And then getting into, from Bromwich, cancellation creates a culture of accountability which is not centralized and is haphazard but needed to come into being. So those are really good quotes that you've got called attention to. It definitely shows a connection, especially if we think about accountability not being centralized and being important, right? In terms of like the voice and being able to advocate. If we think about that power structure, what else did you guys find? Or any thoughts about the quotes they've identified in that connection? So really focusing on why it goes too far, but also why it is kind of necessary, needed to come into being. Yeah, really focusing on its effect. And of course, if we think of like even the name cancel, that's why if we think of there's a huge shift, people wanting to focus on calling it accountability culture. What do you guys think of that as a name change for cancel culture? Do you think it would be more effective for making basically calling attention to these issues in terms of people actually taking and listening to them and creating a conversation? If it shifted to accountability culture, or even James has the suggestion or awareness culture. You guys think those would be more appropriate names or terms? Yeah, so Jaden brings up people might be more more likely to actually make conversation about the situation. Because if we think about that term cancel, it has such a negative connotation.
Mm-hmm.
So by changing that can really help to kind of bring people into that conversation. Val, were you wanting to say something?
No, I agree. I agree with you. What's going on? Sorry, my headset's finally working. No, I agree. It gives it open to conversation instead of such a strong force towards their outlook of their point of view, you know?
That is really important. Awesome. Anything else from group 2? Any other observations or anything else you wanted to kind of call attention to in terms of the connections? If not, we will move on to group 3. So we have Eva, Giselle, and then Jaden. What did you guys find when you guys were thinking about the connections between the different sources? Like which sources did you choose? What connections did you guys find?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So we were looking at the article, the free speech debate isn't really about free speech. It was page 2, I think it was paragraph number 5. And it says, what's being debated is not anyone's right to speech, but rather the right to air that speech in specific platforms like the New York Times without fear of social backlash.
Mm-hmm.
And hold on. My laptop is being a little weird. Okay. And we were saying that, well, what I saw from that was that, like, the right to speech isn't really, like, the problem. Or, like, because, like, people can believe what they believe, but, like, the way they put it out there on a platform is more the problem, and how they put their opinions out there. And we connected it to the documentary, and how the Chick-fil-A guy, the way he put his opinion out there, the way he, talked to that worker, he didn't have to do it that way. That was not necessary at all.
Yeah, so he could have presented his opinion in a very, if we think of connecting to that tone, in a very different way that would have been more understanding.
Yes. And then Jaden had something else that was really good. I don't know if she wants to talk about it, or I don't know.
I already kind of forget, but like she said, I was thinking more about that right now. He did have the right to his opinion, but he did go about it like the wrong way. But I also believe that cancel culture goes about it the wrong way too, because just like he did the wrong thing and put that out there on a platform in like a rude, like just a rude way, like with cancel culture, you should I think people should be the bigger person and try to you shouldn't try to, it's like a weird topic because it's not your position to have to tell people what they can and can't do, but I think that it would be more effective if people did it in more of a conversation way instead of just attacking people, because I know if I was being attacked, I wouldn't actually focus on what I did wrong. It would be more the fact oh, I'm being attacked.
Yeah. So definitely getting back to more conversational to better address the real issue.
Yes, just like he should have addressed the issue in a better way. Cancel culture should address things in a way that is more effective.
Awesome. Anything else from your group? Or we have Raymond presenting the word cancel culture seems to be already tagged with that. Oh, so I think you said that earlier. Sorry. It's like the one thing with the time on the chat. But we have group 4. So we have Alex, Anela, and Olegario, or Ole. So what did you guys call attention to? What connections did you guys make?
For our first one, we called attention to the documentary. We did it like everybody else. We chose the Chick-fil-A one. So we can go to the other example where the other guy who lost his job, the professor at the university. So he went against the popular consensus of the people, and the mob decided that he shouldn't have his job. So even without any evidence against the fact, they chose what's it called when it's guilty before innocent factor instead of the innocent before guilty. They didn't really go look into it as much as they probably should have, and he ended up losing his job there for a while, just similar to the Chick-fil-A guy. So that can definitely hurt somebody for the long run, but he found his way back by making his own little setup.
Definitely. And what connection did you make to one of the other sources?
By other sources, you mean another example that was used in the...
So Bromwich or Beauchamp in terms of what they present?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
So, so the connection, so how does that connect to Bromwich or Beauchamp in terms of what they present about cancel culture?
In terms of Beauchamp, he stated, I didn't connect to Beauchamp specifically, we went to the other one.
Bromwich?
Yeah, Bromwich. And he went, he talked about how cancel culture, everybody's getting canceled right now. And just the average citizen can get canceled now as well. I don't think I understood the prompt for this one actually.
We can definitely see that connection to Bromwich with everyone being canceled. So if we think about the issue of guilty before innocent, right? If we're canceling everybody, if we think about that, right, as like an issue that's going on, or everyone, everything, like it's not going through our actual justice system. Similar to like what we're talking about on Monday in terms of like the different reasons people are canceled, right? It being kind of focused on just canceling instead of kind of actual guilt or kind of how severe like the action really is, or not even kind of doing the research on that situation. Because if we think about like there's like a lot of Bromwich references, like a lot of celebrities who were canceled but not presenting like a legitimate reason. And of course, like if we think about even examples that we've talked about, like I think the one Johnny Depp we've brought up quite frequently. I think you said James Charles as well, right? How they were canceled, but then more information. So of course, like that can definitely connect to that issue of like seeing people as guilty, and then they have to be proven innocent. When our justice system is supposed to be working in the opposite, where it's innocent before proven guilty. But any other observations from your group?
Not unless somebody else in our group has an observation.
Anila, Olegario, how's it going? Do you have any other observations, or we can move on to group 5? Okay, so we will move to group 5. So that would be Angela, Mia, and Raymond. So what connections did you guys find?
From Beauchamp's article, we talked about how it was mostly like talking about how cancel culture is like how it censors like what we say. And on page 2, the second to last paragraph, it listed like a bunch of questions we should ask about like cancel culture and who gets to decide that. And then we thought we were like comparing them, like the differences. So
Well, we do that as well.
We talked about how like the video was more emotional, and it gave like the emotional aspects to canceling people and cancel culture.
Yeah, especially in terms of focusing, like specifically like presenting how it affects individuals.
Yeah, like personally.
Because of course, if we think about like humanizing cancel culture, I think that is a big thing that the CBSN documentary does, because it's a lot easier to empathize with those people than if we think about when it's just listing like a name of a celebrity or somebody who we know has more power, where they're kind of like separate from us, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that definitely is a really big thing. So of course, especially if we think about who gets to decide those questions, right? Like who gets to decide really connects to like how, like when the decision making process, like how much are people considering the feelings of the people who are going to be canceled? Like, does that play a factor? Should that play a factor in terms of deciding whether or not to cancel somebody or hold them accountable? especially if you get into like what we mentioned previously about the documentary in terms of the mental health, right? How much does cancel culture even take into account the mental health effect of the actions of the act of canceling somebody? Awesome. Any thoughts about that? Or questions? So we have our last group, which is Artie, Riley, and Virginia. So what connections did you guys find?
Okay, well, I guess what we were discussing, we focused more on, you can say, on power. So we did, I don't know if he put it on the chat there, we put Birchman article and then the video.
Mhm.
So it would be on the third page, like fifth paragraph down. It talks about how, cancel culture was born of a desire for control. And then people have limited power over what is presented to them on social media platform. And so it's just basically the paragraph about Logan Paul, how people had to take their own justice into their own hands. So we compared that to the part in the beginning of the video, which is, I believe, 31 to 40 seconds in. It literally says like it's all about power, and then it basically goes into a quick snippet about talking about the Bon Appetit article or the editor, how they were basically, trying to seek for that power that they needed their own justice because nothing was happening, you can say. So it was like we're just comparing how she took that picture that was sent to her, you can say, into a power in a way to amplify what was going on, that it was not right. So we were more concerned on power in that sense.
Yeah. Interesting. So definitely about that desire to control and figuring out like how you can get more control. I think from what I know about the Logan Paul situation, right? That video was up for quite a while before it was taken down, right? So it's
I
like,
believe so. Honestly, I don't know if it was on for that long, but I know they try to take it down all over YouTube, even animated ones or even like re-recorded ones that people try to upload.
mm-hmm. And then Riley brings up the issue about how, like, even if they have good intentions at first and wanted to right wrongs, the power then corrupted them and began to cause more problems. And then he says he doesn't think the YouTube took the video down, even Logan Paul did himself eventually. So of course, the real question of like, if we think about power, because like the audience for the Logan Paul example, they have no power to take a video down. They only can report it. So of course, by calling attention to it, like that's the only kind of power in order to kind of force other people to take action and take the video down. It's probably find out like if we Google that a little bit more. Yeah, but definitely getting into like how power like corrupts the situation in certain examples of cancellation. I know, but it also, if we think about it, like, or it can have like a positive result. Because I think if we think of like the example of Bon Appetit, the guy with the racist videos, I think it was the racist image in that one specifically. Like he did get fired, and then the company was like, did kind of, they claimed that they were going to make more changes to have more diversity and more equality between their employees. And then Artie is adding, the professor in the video also mentions that it is important to engage in conversation opposed to simply overthrowing someone as a mom when you disagree with them. Yeah, so in terms of that difference, so mob mentality versus like a conversation about accountability. there is like a really big difference there that's really important to note. Any other thoughts or any other observations or connections? You can see that the articles and the documentary, they do add different things to the conversation, right? Different focuses, or foci, I always forget how to pluralize that. So if we think about like the biggest thing with Prom Witch is focus on examples of celebrity in terms of cancel culture. Beauchamp is really focused on the issue of free speech within cancel culture, and the documentary is really humanizing and presenting kind of just everyday people who have been canceled and how that's different. Because of course, if we think about, right, another kind of thing that's really important for cancel culture in the observation and this discussion about power is, right, if we think about like voice and sharing and kind of putting things out there as a celebrity, like you're choosing to make your life kind of, trying to think of how to say it, but you're putting your life out there in terms of people knowing who you are and kind of all the criticism that comes with that. However, if we think about like the professor and then the Chick-fil-A guy example, right, that was not like an active choice that they made. So of course, like who we cancel, like the severity of it or how we view it can really change depending on the example we're looking at. With like Logan Paul and him choosing to post the video of that man in the suicide forest versus the Chick-fil-A guy who chose to post the video, but they have very different platforms. So it's kind of the scale is very different. Anything else that we call attention to? We can move forward. You guys got any questions or any other thoughts? You can do a thumbs up if you guys are good, so we can move forward. Awesome. Okay. So moving forward, as we get into kind of really discussing these moral questions and getting into our prompt for our third paper, which we'll talk more about on Monday when we get into drafting, right? For this assignment, the questions, like how we're responding, is really assessing like the moral situation that goes into cancel culture. So for this assignment, you guys are going to be choosing at least one of the kind of listed 4 options. And you're going to use examples from at least 2 of the sources to really back up your points about cancel culture. And the final paper is going to be at least 3 to 4 full pages. It can be longer than that. But when we're getting into these moral questions, it's really important to really assess kind of what is being asked and how we can respond to them. So like looking down and breaking down these moral questions, we have that first group, which is asking, so what are the moral obligations for individuals and society to cancel others for offensive or inappropriate actions? When are individuals and society at large morally obligated to correct the behavior of others? The second group is, how should individuals and society choose who to cancel? What should they consider if they incorrectly cancel someone? How does that affect them and their morality? Right. And then our third grouping, so if an individual is canceled, does the cancellation inspire them or help them to change? What does the individual need to do to be forgiven? And who is able to forgive the individual? And lastly, we have the question, so is cancel culture moral, amoral, or immoral? Has it gone too far, or is it necessary to advocate for societal change? So like if we think about these questions, right, these moral questions are really breaking down different aspects of this conversation. Yeah, that went. So if we think of like that first one, like what stands out to you guys about those questions that are being asked? Thoughts, observations? Like, what is the biggest part of that in terms of discussing the morality of this? Especially if we're getting into moral, ethical philosophy. If we think in terms of how subjective it is, in terms of the choices that are made within this. What stands out to you guys about the wording of those questions?
I mean, the world of morals and all of them.
So if we think of like that question, that's really what we're assessing here. So if we think about how you're going to be explaining it is really focused on moral, specifically moral obligations. So if we think about the term obligation, right, what is that really saying about how we're responding to this? Especially if we connect it to the example of the trolley problem, right? So that trolley problem, like if you are morally obligated to take action and change that course, that is really, that's like, we can create that parallel in terms of cancel culture. So if we think about, right, with cancel culture, like how can we change that analogy of the trolley problem for the moral obligation to do something?
It's basically, you're saying, I mean, if we compare it to the trolley problem, it's almost like looking at the one person, like if you switch the track leg, okay, you know, it might screw up this one person's life, but at least I'm protecting, you know, these so many people within this community, you know, who don't have that voice, you know.
So it's like really focusing on like protecting others and potentially like sacrificing the one. So doing like the most good. So if you think about like that as the trolley problem, we can see it in terms of like if you think about like one of the articles really assessing in terms of thinking of, will you cancel out one person for those actions in order to discourage those actions from others? So you're really like discouragement. To really teach them and show them what is acceptable or what's not acceptable. So you're morally obligated to kind of take that ground in order to protect the future by preventing this from people from doing the same thing. So it's really, if we think of like like the train is kind of going towards them. Another way we can like view that is like if we think about it, like the moral obligation to correct others' behavior, if we think about the offensive or inappropriate actions, if we think about the moral obligations that we were talking about before, it really depends on what those offensive or inappropriate actions are. If we think about the individual versus society's choice. Because if we think about that, if we think about like individuals being like us and everyday people and society being us as, at large, or even the government, if we see somebody doing something that's offensive or inappropriate, we could also see that it's not, we could argue that it's not our individual, right, obligation to do something, but it's government's obligation to do something to stop that. especially if we think about some of the worst actions, right? If we're thinking of the top tier, so tier 1 of our classification of cancel culture versus tier 3 or tier 4, where it's like more like us as individuals can do something. So really thinking about it in that way. And of course, if we think about that term obligations, right, what does that also like imply about these situations? Like if we think about especially that connection to the trolley problem, where it's like you have to make a choice to do something, so you can choose to ignore it or let somebody get away with something, or you can choose to do something and call attention to it and potentially like cancel the offensive or inappropriate actions. So if we think about moral obligation, like that obligation is saying, well, you have to make a choice in that situation. And then your moral, like your morality of that choice is really going to be called into attention. And then our second question, so should they, like how should individuals choose? The biggest thing in terms of the moral dilemma in this question is that second. So if they incorrectly cancel someone, how does that affect them and their morality? It's like, what do you guys think about that? So like, are you now guilty and immoral if you canceled somebody incorrectly without enough information, or you just jumped on that bandwagon for that mom mentality? Or without listening to them? Like, what does that say about the morality of people who've canceled others incorrectly?
I think it depends on your actions afterwards, you know, because if you're just like, well, screw them, they're wrong, you know, but then it comes out and you're just like, well, I'm sticking to my guns, they're wrong. But if you're like, you know what, like I should have looked into the facts, and the next time it happens and you look into the facts, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean you're an immoral person. You just made an immoral action. You know, it's kind of the same thing with the people in the tier 4, like, you know, they're borderline, you know, being immoral, but they have that opportunity to correct themselves, bring themselves back, you know, and engage them.
So like maybe like it, as long as you take accountability, you're still a moral person. But if you ignore that you did something wrong or made a bad choice, then that could maybe affect your morality.
Yeah, I think of it as kind of like if you're being mean to someone and everyone calls you out and you're just like, well, they deserved it, you know, and then like, you know, could you go through that debate? You're like, should I apologize? Was I wrong? You know, but then even if you weren't, you know, it's still like, okay, you know, just be like, sorry, you know, even if you don't wholeheartedly mean it, but then at least it gives you that opportunity to redeem yourself in further instances.
Mm-hmm. So that's really kind of what we assess. And then our third one, right, how would you guys respond? So if an individual is canceled, does the cancellation inspire them or help them to change? What does the individual need to do to be forgiven, and who is able to forgive the individual? Oh, and James brings up a point for the last one. So it's a petition. It's not guaranteed the organizations will fire people. Is that for, like, is that for the second question or third question, James? Second, okay. Yeah. So for the second one, it really depends. Like if you canceled someone, it was incorrect. Like if there wasn't like a huge negative repercussion for that person, then you're less guilty. But if they did get really affected, say they lost their job, then of course you would be more guilty. What about number 3? Like what stands out to you guys about that? Like how would you guys respond to that in terms of these moral questions? Because the morality of forgiveness, especially if we want people to take accountability, we think about like the connection to our discussion about tone, right? This could even connect to if we cancel someone, depending on the tone we use for that cancellation, it can inspire them or it can make them defensive. and not change. So it really depends on how we're canceling somebody. If we're doing it responsibly in terms of starting a conversation and just being like, hey, you did this and that was offensive. Like, please think about your actions in the future versus like, you did this, you're a terrible person. Yeah, and then Dan brings up the point. So it depends on the type of person they are. So if we think about it, some people are really stubborn and not willing to acknowledge when they've done something wrong, right? So then that really kind of, it goes on them. So if we think about the morality of that situation, right, you could say like canceling someone, you've done your moral duty, but it doesn't mean that that other person is willing to change. So that really complicates it. And then James brings up a really interesting point in terms of if we cancel somebody, it could radicalize them and they could become worse in terms of whatever actions or things that they do. Can you think of like an example of a situation or a person who would become more radical when they've become canceled?
I mean, I can't necessarily say the person was canceled because like bullying was different back then. We didn't have the online stuff, but it came to light that like, basically he was just assumed he was a bully, he was mean-hearted, people called him out on that, so he said, fine, if you're going to see me as a bully, I'm going to be a bully then, and just came back as even more of a, a jerk and an a-hole to people. So, and I've seen the opposite where people have been called a bully and they're like, oh, crap, like one of my best friends was kind of an a-hole in high school, but now he's all about helping people. He coaches little league soccer and stuff like that, and like completely turned the corner.
Yeah.
So
kind of like fulfilling prophecy in some way. Like if you present or view somebody as bad, like then they may start to view themselves as bad and starting to act bad, essentially. Yeah, that's a really good point. James brings up the example of like school shooters or student shooters. So of course, like if it could make them really angry, and of course they could it can lead to the mentality of like me versus everybody else. And then of course, like if we think of like that question about like forgiveness, we kind of mentioned before, like with what an individual needs to do to be forgiven, with like the rise of like apology videos on YouTube. But if we think about that complication with that professor who was trying to explain where he was coming from, right? So like really illustrating like what are we looking for? Like what do we need to do in order to be open to forgiveness in terms of an individual or what we're looking for? Action, and of course that question of like who is able to forgive the individual we've mentioned before. Yeah, so Dan brings up the really good point in terms of one issue with cancel culture is people apologize, and then even if it's heartfelt, they still people just don't take it seriously and look at them as just trying to save face or save their careers. We think about celebrities. So if we think about like forgiveness, right? If somebody apologizes and we don't take it, like, well, then what are we looking for? Or, right, should we apologize and then just pay more attention to their actions moving forward, whether or not to figure out if it was legitimate? Because of course, if somebody apologizes for something and then they do it again, then they were probably never really sorry or never really understood the problem to begin with. Yeah, so actions, that's the reason we have that saying, actions speak louder than words. So looking for those actions. So James brings out working to better themselves. So like rehab or a charity involvement, or even if we think about donations, but then people sometimes can look at donations badly in terms of, well, you could have donated, but you had to donate and tell me, so therefore you're doing that for appearance sake and not necessarily because you feel bad. So that's even a double-edged sword for celebrities. But it really depends on kind of the offense. And last, we have the question, so is cancel culture moral, amoral, or immoral? Has it gone too far, or is it necessary to advocate for societal change? So if we think about it, we have talked about issues of morality, but we haven't really defined these terms and the difference between moral, amoral, and immoral. So like, what are the differences there between moral, amoral, and immoral? Because if you think about moral, like how do we define something, an action is moral? Like, what is the definition of that? Or if you had to define it in your own words, how would you guys define a person as moral? What do you guys think? Beneficial, not hurting
What's the
people.
question again? Sorry.
So like, how do we define moral? So James defined moral as like beneficial. So not hurting anyone. So essentially we could say like being moral is essentially good. So if we think about the difference, then we're thinking about what is the difference between moral and amoral and immoral. So like, how would we define amoral or immoral? If we think about the nuances of that. Well, one of these is the inverse, it's the opposite of moral. So which one's the opposite of moral? Immoral, yeah. So if you think of, if moral is beneficial, not hurting one, it's good, then immoral is bad, right? Doesn't benefit others or hurts others. So if you think of like immoral action, like you're doing something that only benefits yourself and hurts others. So that's like the definition specifically if we think of selfish people or selfish action, we see that as immoral because it's only benefiting that one person and it's hurting other people. Amoral, as Dan kind of defined in the chat, it doesn't necessarily between right or wrong. So if we think about that, amoral is kind of neutral. So if we think about something that's amoral, it's neither right or wrong, or neither good or bad. So if we think about like cancel culture, right? Cancel culture can be good and can be beneficial for people, but it can be bad, it can hurt others. Dan presents, so amoral people would just let the trolley do whatever it wants. If it kills the 1 or the 5, it wasn't their choice to make. So yeah, that's one perspective for being amoral. So if we think about like how we could view cancel culture as amoral, right? We could see it as amoral because you're just calling attention to actions, and whether or not the effect is good or bad is out of your hands. Or even cancel culture itself is not right or wrong. It's how people can kind of go to extremes. So it's the people themselves that make it moral or immoral. It's not the culture by itself. So that can be really complex in terms of it. Especially if we think about the examples of cancel culture that definitely go too far or are very hurtful, or the examples of cancel culture that has shown to have benefits. right? So we can see it in a number of different ways. So in terms of this, right, all of these questions are really addressing those issues of morality. And then Dan's presenting in the chat. I know a lot of people with anxiety or with anxiety and depression that are amoral. So what do you mean by that?
I think just because, like, I mean, when you think about, anxiety, they just kind of have that sense of like you said, you don't want to be wrong, but you don't, like, they're not sure if they're right and they're not sure if they're wrong. It's kind of that, okay, well, it could hurt this person, but could it hurt this group? Like, and you just kind of get to that point. You're like, okay, well, I'm just not going to defend either. Like,
Yeah.
I'm just going to let it take its place, versus me interjecting and then, kind of, because then that wraps up your anxiety even more, because it goes back to that, what if we canceled them wrong? What if we did? What if what if we're completely wrong? But then that's one of those, what if they're right? And I chose not to, like, you kind of just let it, like, okay, well, there's enough people out there that'll take care of it,
Yeah. I would kind of rephrase it because I think it is really an interesting point that you bring up, but I would say that it's mainly like people with anxiety or anxiety and depression, like, question the morality of their choices more.
Oh, yeah, that's true, I guess, yeah.
Versus it being immoral. So it kind of, so it's mainly like how they view situations versus like the choices themselves they make.
That's true.
Yeah. Because I would say as long as you're considering and you're really worried about the choice, like, because sometimes anxiety can be paralyzing, like that, like being too late to make a choice doesn't necessarily make you amoral or bad.
Yeah, that's true.
But it's a good thing to know in terms of mental health, because mental health does play a role, not necessarily just for like the people who are canceled, but also like when we're dealing with that moral choice to cancel someone, especially if we're canceling them correctly and we're doing the work, then we should feel some emotion behind that isn't just anger, right? We should kind of go through that thought process like people with anxiety have. Because I have anxiety, let's be honest, my mind does not shut up. It is the most annoying thing. Gotta overthink everything.
It's like being haunted all the time.
I mean, maybe it's not a ghost in my apartment. Maybe it's my anxiety manifesting itself. Who knows?
People with anxiety feed other people with anxiety. It's a terrible, terrible world.
And people who don't know what anxiety feel like make anxiety worse for other people. It's terrible.
Just get over it. Just get over it.
That hurt.
Oh.
Triggered. So moving forward, so you're going to say something?
I was going to say that's my least favorite phrase in the world. Just get over it.
I've heard it too many times and it's just like, you don't understand. I can't. I know my feelings are illogical, but they won't go away.
I told my buddy, I was like, it's like me telling you to jump over a hurdle, but your feet are cemented to the floor.
It's a really good
example. Get over it. Come on, just get over it.
Every time you repeat it, I'm triggered. That emotional response, because I've heard it too many times.
You're good. You're good. You're doing great. You're good.
Anxiety doesn't allow positive affirmations either. That's another pet peeve. It's just like, don't tell me to use positive thoughts. It's not how this works. So like moving forward, because we are going to end class early because I do have an appointment I need to get to. Do you guys have any questions about the prompt before we kind of end class early today? Any questions before we get into it? Because we will talk more about it on Monday when we go over drafting. So questions, concerns. So in terms of like this, you want to choose at least one of these options, but you can, if you want to, address like two of them if you feel like you are interested in presenting those points, and we'll talk about putting that together more on Monday. And if you do have any questions as we kind of move through the weekend, just let me know and I can help you out. But we do not have any official like homework assignment over the weekends. So the only thing is you want to start to brainstorm your response for paper 3. So by Monday, you just want to for sure know like which question or questions you want to answer. There is no outline that's due for this because we're in that time crunch, and because the outline, how you organize, is going to really change depending on the questions you're answering and how many questions you're answering. And then of course enjoying your weekend, because it is Halloween weekend, even though I don't know if Halloween is actually happening for most people. It's real tough to say.
They can't arrest everybody.
I mean, but you don't want to be that one person who's the example.
Yeah. We're
Please
just
do
keeping
not get arrested over the weekends, because that would, yeah. You do not want to be in a jail cell during coronavirus.
So since our rough drafts are due on Wednesday, does that mean we're going to do the meetings on Wednesday and Monday, since the 11th is a day off?
So in terms of that's why in terms of it, so we will have conferencing next Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Monday, and Tuesday of the week after.
Okay. So we'll have a normal class on Monday, and then Wednesday will be conferences.
Exactly. And
Okay,
then
that's what I figured, but I just wanted to clear. I wasn't sure if we clarified that or not. So
Veterans Day week, we will not have class because we will just go to conferencing the beginning part of the week.
right. Okay,
And then revising your paper.
got it. Makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Well, have a great one. Let me know if you have any questions. And of course, stay safe.